Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Rajang Kilachan Mughal tent. The title of this next session is Oceania, Yonder and Beyond. We have with us Greg Sheridan, Harinder Sidhu and Swapan Dasgupta in conversation with Amitabh Mattoo. And I'll tell you a little bit about Amitabh. He's the CEO and Honorary Director of the India Institute in Delhi and Professor of International Relations at the University of Melbourne. Professor Mattoo also serves as advisor to the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir. He's a Professor of Disarmament Studies at JNU, and he's been a member of the National Security Advisory Board and also a member of the National Knowledge Commission to the Prime Minister of India. Mattoo received his doctorate from the University of Oxford and has been a visiting professor at Stanford University, the University of Notre Dame, and the University of Illinois, and the Maison de Sciences de l'Homme at Paris. Mattoo was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Jammu from 2002 to 2008, and recognising his contribution to education and public life, the President of India honoured Mattoo with the Padma Shri. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much, India, for that very kind and generous introduction. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the presence of the Treasurer of the Victorian Government, Mr. Tim Pallas. Where is Mr. Pallas?
Bravo.
Mr. Pallas very kindly hosted the Australia-India Institute and the Leadership Dialogue at the Victorian Parliament, and he's here in a personal capacity. But thank you for your generosity, Treasurer. We really have a very distinguished panel today. We have a panel which understands Australia and India from varying perspectives. We have the High Commissioner, Harinder Sidhu, of a Punjabi with roots in Punjab, who traveled to Australia via Malaysia and is one of the senior-most members of the diplomatic corps, who has already demonstrated the wealth of experience and wisdom that she can bring to this new relationship, this new nascent relationship that we are all trying to build. We have Swapan Dasgupta, who discovered Australia late, and I must say that I can take some responsibility for his discovery of Australia, but is a member of Parliament, one of our most distinguished commentators, writers, thinkers, and someone who also believes in the potential of this relationship between India and Australia, and that's what I'm reducing this ponderous title to. And you have Greg Sheridan, a great champion of the India-Australia relationship, who is the foreign editor of the Australian at day, but at night he works hard on the Australia-India relationship, and he has to do it if he has to survive at home, because he's married to a very martial Sikh lady called Jessie. And Jessie, where are you? Can you show us raise your hand. So we have these three lady and two gentlemen going to reflect upon this relationship. And as I said, this relationship is new. And like this, all new relationships, there's a new buzz, a new creativity, a new fervor. But there isn't a sense of urgency always when you discover each other. I remember a Buddhist scholar once telling me that once the British resident's wife visited the 13th Dalai Lama in the Potala Palace in Lhasa, she took with her pictures of the London Post, trying to educate the Dalai Lama about how technology had changed the world. And she showed pictures of Amelia Earhart and her solo flight. And the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, was very impressed, but he asked one question: why was this lady in such a hurry? But there is a certain urgency today, only because we are confronted with a world which seems to be collapsing around us. Terror, technology, all the various kinds of trade protectionism as Prime Minister Modi reflected upon, to a certain tiredness of this planet, various T's, alliterations, tiredness in the planet reflected in climate change, and not being able to bear the burden of the way in which the human species is exploiting the earth, what do Australia and India do together? How can they save the world? Bilaterally, multilaterally? And what are the signs of optimism? High Commissioner, how do you think you can help India and Australia to save the world?
That's a very big question. I think I want to go back to the point that you started with, which is that this is a new relationship. But in many ways it's not, actually. It's quite an old relationship. I think there are a number of chestnuts that get, trotted out about the Australia-India relationship. And one of them is, we discover each other every 20 years or so, and we get terribly excited, and it sort of lapses back to the way things were. But I actually think that is an old chestnut. I think that the relationship now is very different, and it's different for a number of reasons. One is that for Australia, we've seen in the last decade a dramatic growth in our Indian diaspora and the numbers of Indians who come to migrate to Australia. And that's tripled in the last decade, the numbers of new students from India. We see Indian students being the second largest group of students, overseas students in Australia as well. So Indians are present, visible. They are now
that
Victorian very distinct, very. Is that too? We are Australia. One thing is that Australia recognizes that it cannot, just as in the 1970s, it had to grow out of the mother country syndrome. Now, that entire US umbrella which actually defined Australia's vision of the world, is now being re-examined. India, at the same time, post the Cold War, is re-examining its priorities. From being a very relatively insular place, we are gradually starting to look outwards. Australia is not a threatening power. And I think that's very important. Why does India and Japan get along so well? Because both of them are not threatening powers. So I think in this sort of which I think Greg in his articles have talked rather specifically about the Quad, because he doesn't like the term. He likes the concept, but he might. I think at least 3 of those pillars, Australia, Japan, and India, see themselves as having a certain convergence of interests. Now, whether the 4th element of the quadrilateral can actually fit into that bill is something we all have our own views, and that we are talking about the United States. Where is the United States going to go? But for the moment, I think, India and Australia are discovering each other's potential. And I think this outward look, if India is often accused of being a bit too protectionist. I think the same can be said about Australia as well, because it too has its never take handmade paper into Australia. You'll have the sniffer dogs going in. So Australia is very, very conscious about what you can do or what you can't do. And certainly it's fair enough. But it is looking outwards, India is looking outwards, and there's the commonality of the English language, there's the rule of law, and there's cricket. And between that, I think we can construct a relationship, along with the new diaspora which has come in, 700,000 strong, I'm told, which I think we can do. And I think the meeting of these joint strategic dialogues, the meeting of the Navy chiefs, etc., presages something interesting in future.
Greg, Swapan has somehow actually stolen the question that I was going to ask you. So there are 2 questions. First of all, the question that I asked the High Commissioner and Swapan, can India and Australia save the world? And you're not allowed to answer only if Tony Abbott comes back. The second question is that quite apart from the convergence of values, you and I know as realists there has to be a convergence of interests. And now today we see an aggressive, belligerent, and fortunately I'm not a diplomat and you're not a diplomat and we're not parliamentarians either. You see an aggressive, belligerent, imperialistic China in the making. Can India and Australia save the world potentially from such a hegemonic, aggressive, militaristic China?
Well, Amitabh, what a pleasure it is to be here, and thank you so much. I will answer your question, but I just want to say 2 things initially. When Swapan was saying there was a certain stereotype of Australians, I thought he was going to say the kind of Crocodile Dundee, He-Man Aussie bloke who wrestles crocodiles and is fearless and bends knives with his bare hands. But Swapan is obviously a good friend of mine, and I've disabused him of that stereotype, sad to say, over all these years. The other thing I was going to say is, Amitabh, you're quite right to mention the importance of my wife to my geostrategic views. And if anybody finds anything offensive in what I say here, please just go and see JC straight after the session. I do want to echo the High Commissioner on one thing. This is actually a very old relationship. The greatest man ever to lead Australia was named Alfred Deakin, and he was a Prime Minister in about 1902. It's about 120 odd years ago. He visited India before he ever visited England. He wrote 3 books about India. They're very eccentric books. He's a very eccentric man, wonderful Prime Minister, half crazy, former journalist, a bit of a nut, thought he was talking to the gods most of the time, fabulous Prime Minister, and an answer to the idea that Australian political leaders are boring. No leader has been as eccentric as Deakin. But what Deakin exemplified was the presence of India in the Australian mind, always. And Deakin was a very important geostrategic player in his day. When he went to imperial conferences and so forth, the British would have the British government representative and the representative of the government in India. And Deakin would refuse to talk to them. He'd say, these people don't represent India, they represent the British government. So I want them out of the room. I'm not talking to them. They're just civil servants of the British government. So Deakin, in a sense, was the first international statesman to campaign for Indian independence, and greatly annoyed the Brits, of course, which is, you know, a virtuous thing in itself. But on the contemporary question, what we can do together, two things strike me. Modi's moment at Davos the other day was a kind of pivot moment in modern history. It was the Indian moment. It was the Indian coming out show. Here we are, we've got a great story to tell the global economy. We're going to be an engine of global growth. We want the Indian economic experience to be shared by the whole world. We're going to become again next year what we've been for most of the recent years, the fastest growing big economy in the world. And everybody needs to have an India strategy. Indeed, the global environment is always characterised by its leading powers: Britain, the United States and Russia, China, and hopefully soon India. Where does Australia fit in? Australia fits in two or three ways. The first is we're one of the only countries in the world which is seriously underpopulated. Now, there are people in Australia, the Greens Party, who thinks what the world needs is fewer and better Australians. I don't agree with them. I think we need lots more Australians, and I'd be very happy if lots of them came from India. And India is typically the first or second largest source of migrants to Australia. 700,000 Indian Australians, 65,000 Indian students in Australia. We need lots more people. We're also a universal nation. We pay no heed to inheritance, genetics, creed, anything like that. One of Alfred Deakin's very strong early decisions for Australia was that there would be no imperial honours, there's no sirs or lords or anything like that. We're absolutely egalitarian, we're a creedal nation. If you sign up to Australian values, you're welcome to be an Australian citizen, you're as good as anyone else. Now, I do think it is in the coincidence of values that India and Australia find their natural expression. I'm a big fan of the quadrilateral security dialogue. It brings together four great democracies: Japan, India, Australia and the United States. Some people say this is offensive to China, that we should get together. But why should democracies be ashamed of celebrating their democratic values? One of the good things about having an Indian moment in global history is that India will project its own values onto the global system. And those values are democracy, human rights, liberalism. Nobody knows what the limit of China's strategic ambitions are, but the whole region will be better able to cope with China if like-minded nations like Japan, the United States, India and Australia are working together. So I think that's all to the good.
Greg, I think you said it, and if there's someone who likes hashtags, the Indian moment in the Asian century is the core of this conversation. But High Commissioner, I live part of the time in Kashmir, troubled Kashmir, but when I want peace, quiet and good coffee, I go to Melbourne. What inspires you about India?
Oh, wow. Oh gosh, where do I start? When people ask me what I love most about being here, my answer is almost always the people I meet. You know, you can about India's size, its diversity, its interest, but not a day goes past where I don't meet somebody who looks at the world in a unique way. And no two Indians, interestingly enough, look at the world the same way. So it's always an interesting conversation. The things that I enjoy are the conversations I have with people, the youth. I have to say young Indians are seriously the cause of my great optimism about India's future. They are not hidebound by the past. They're aspirational about the future, and they're incredibly confident of their ability to achieve their aspirational future. And I actually think that that's going to be a very key driving force. I'm constantly impressed with the quality of the young people I meet. And then the third thing is really the diversity of the place. It is the engine that drives the dynamism of the Indian system. It is also what makes governing India so very complex. And as a diplomat, this is the most fascinating place to watch from that perspective. You know, India is a place that I find constantly intellectually stimulating, constantly fascinating, a place where I learn something new every single day, and then a place which completely confounds the very simple task that my Prime Minister sets before me, which is, Harinder, go off and explain India to Australians. And I struggle with that every single day, but I'm glad of the challenge.
Thank you. Swapan, you are sui generis in many ways, an Anglophile in saffron attire. What would it take to make you an Ossophile? You've been there 3 times now. I suspect all 3 times on the invitation of the Australia-India Institute. When would be the time that you took your family there and said, this is better than the Oxbridge Club on Tottenham Road or wherever it is?
Well, I'm not going to compare the old Commonwealth and the new Commonwealth at all. Neither am I going to get into the other rather contentious issue of the old dominions versus the new ones. No, I don't think they're really, they are similar in a lot of ways. They drive on the right side of the road, if you mean, which is the left side of the road, which is reassuring always for people like me. I think you're looking for cultural bonding between India and Australia. You're going to get it at one level. But I think when you're talking about a shared relationship, you've got to go much beyond that. I think the exposure of Australia to India is still relatively limited. It's still largely, when you talk about Australia, you'll either talk about beer or you'll talk about cricket. It's still not the mere fact that there is such a, or increasingly celebrity chef. The mere fact that Australia, the sheer vibrancy of Australia is still something that hasn't fully seeped into India. It's getting there. I've never met a more energetic High Commission than the Australian High Commission over the years, and they've really aggressively sold Australia to India. But I think it's that political convergence. Now, that political convergence has, and this is where I think I would disagree a little with Greg. I think it's because of the elephant in the room that that convergence is more marked now. That there is this common perception, which didn't exist in Australia at one time, that China is not always necessarily a benign power. And I think Australia at one time did believe that, or at least certain sections of Australia certainly did believe that, or one Prime Minister of Australia certainly believed that. I think it's that perception that we need to have certain internal defenses, a certain system of integrated understanding. The mere fact that the Australian strategic doctrine today talks about the Indo-Pacific, to my mind, suggests something important. Now, these are more than mere diplomatic games. This is something which is there. Now, where that links up with the so-called mother country, which you alluded to, is through a redefined Commonwealth, in my view. And I think this is very important because in April we are going to have a Commonwealth heads of government. And that Commonwealth is very important because Britain has run out of emotional, physical, economic resources to actually be the driving force of the Commonwealth. So here, unless countries like Canada, Australia, India, South Africa can actually inherit that Commonwealth and take it forward, we might as well let it lapse into history. It gives us a monumental multilateral agency of perhaps an English-speaking union, which in there. So that's where the linkages take place. Now, I'm very optimistic. I'm not necessarily defensive about the fact that I'm an Anglophile. And neither am I very defensive about the fact that I'm saffron. I think both harmoniously, as long as my intellectual system allows it to coexist.
Thank you. Greg, you've had the Australian foreign policy white paper released recently. You will have the report by Peter Verghese, which looks at the economic relationship. But we know bilateralism can take you only this far and no further, especially when you still have the United States as the single most important player in the international system. Do you think Donald Trump and his presidency will try this relationship even stronger?
Look, let me say one bold thing in defence of Donald Trump. He's been very good for newspapers, and it's hard for me to be completely negative on someone who has been good for newspaper sales and circulation. But I want to take up a point of Swapan's about to use a wonderfully, splendidly mixed metaphor, the elephant in the room, referring to China, so to speak. Swapan's perception is correct. We are now, you know, Angela Merkel asked Tony Abbott what drove Australian policy towards China, and Tony answered with characteristic honesty, said two things, greed and fear. And that was absolutely correct. But I would conceptualise it a bit differently. I don't think we've been driven into India's arms by a fear of China. I don't think that's right. Certainly one of the big security challenges today is what to do with an aggressive China that is throwing its weight around on the Indian border in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and everywhere else, interfering in domestic politics of other nations and so on. That's a problem. But there are always security problems, and big important nations like India and Australia should collaborate on them. What I would rather say to Indian friends is this. India, of course, is an immensely complex, ancient and magnificent culture, but all countries are quite complex, and Australia is quite complex too. Australia is a naturally globalist country with a very complex set of power dynamics that it inherits and deals with. Our ancient history is Aboriginal. Our recent modern history is British and European, and more recently Asian. First East Asian, then South Asian. Our security alliance is with North America. Our investment relationships are with Britain and the United States predominantly. Our trade relationship is with Northeast Asia. Our security environment is with Southeast Asia. Our security responsibilities are with the South Pacific. This is an extraordinarily complex set of dynamics for an Australian policymaker to deal with. They're not as complex as what Mr. Modi has to deal with when he sits in New Delhi, but they are very, very complex. If there's a crisis in the Solomon Islands, it's our responsibility. If there's a coup in Indonesia, it has profound implications for our security. Now, I think what India and Australia have lacked has been a big economic partnership, because with all those dimensions, what tends to drive a relationship is either a security crisis or an economic relationship. We've lacked those with India. Thank God we haven't had a security crisis. I do think now the people-to-people links are so strong and they're booming so greatly. And every year, as I say, India is the first or second country in source of our immigrants. It's such a big part of our higher education system. That drives the politicians. Not all of our politicians are as brilliant, dynamic, proactive as Tim Pallas here in the audience, you know, coming out to educate himself about India through his own efforts. So our politicians tend to be a bit reactive. They've got to respond to all these things. The people-to-people dynamic is now driving the India-Australia relationship. At the same time, India's emergence onto the global stage is very important. At the same time, the opportunity presented by the Indian economy is very important. But let me finish with this thought. India has always been in the Australian consciousness very profoundly. One of the great novels of my country is Across the Sea Wall by the great novelist Christopher Koch, in which he declares that Indians and Australians, this was written in about 1955, Indians and Australians, he says, are the true brothers under the sun, because we both dealt with the psychology of colonialism under the British and found our own different ways to independence and had to distance ourselves psychologically and come to grips with our own national circumstances. There's much more to this relationship, I think, than what has been discovered in the last couple of years.
High Commissioner, let me just endorse what Swapan said in terms of the energy of the High Commission and your personal energy that you bring to this relationship. A chutzpah almost, an audacity that this can work, this will work. But do you often see an asymmetry in terms of response that today Australia and Australians are much more engaged then India, or at least the Ministry of External Affairs, is in fostering this bilateral project? And added to that, a corollary, would then the world of ideas, the world of books, arts, paintings, is that a way to build a stronger foundation for this relationship? How many Aussies in this hall? Can you raise your hands?
Oh my.
Wow. Bravo. High Commissioner.
So I think the thing is we need to think about what a relationship between two countries is about. And I think Greg sort of touched on it. I just want to sort of peel it back a layer or so. So I'm going to be quite crude about this, but crudely speaking, because governments are quite sort of hard-nosed, when we think about how we build a relationship with another country, it starts with economics. The thing that grabs our attention, frankly, is money. So we're doing lots of trade with a particular country, and this has been our model since pretty much the 1970s, 1980s. We do lots of trade, and we wake up and we go, gosh, that country is really important to us because we've got lots of trade tied up in it. Let's try to build on that. And the trade in its own right brings people going backwards and forwards. It builds the people-to-people links. The trade means that we're a security partner.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And that, that all those things flow from the trade relationship. Now, that's not the way the path of the India-Australia relationship is taking at the moment. At the moment, it's a bit inverted from our own understanding, which is that the security relationship is actually starting to become the foremost thing. The most dynamic part in the Australia-India relationship right now is the military-to-military relationships we have, the strategic dialogues we're having, the shared sense of partnership that's coming out, and how we actually face the world that is changing dramatically before our eyes. And the second thing that's driving it is the people-to-people thing. And Greg's right, the economic relationship is kind of lagging behind. It's not that it's a bad relationship, it's quite a good economic relationship, but it's nowhere near running as fast as the strategic relationship. And what we have to do is actually to accept that that is a very good basis for a solid and a lasting relationship, or a good basis to build on for a solid and a lasting relationship, rather than fret endlessly, I think, about why we're not trading enough. The fact is, our economies are very similar in many ways. India has its own resources. It doesn't need buckets of resources from Australia. It needs some, but not as much as, say, China. It was the case with China. So we have to think about that. We also have to think about what keeps us connected over the long term. And that's where I think, again, we come back to the people-to-people relationship. Cricket and being a democracy and being part of the Commonwealth was never going to be enough to build a deep and sustainable relationship, because there was no basis for understanding. Books, literature, art, the things that get us inside the heads of Indians and things that get Indians inside the heads of Australians, that's the stuff that will build the relationship going forward.
Although, if I might just intervene, I was absolutely horrified in Australia when I read a research paper or a policy document by a think tank, or maybe it was from the Australia India Institute, which says that Australia must devalue the importance of cricket in its relationship with India, because it is considered very much an Anglo-Saxon relic and it conveys all the wrong impression. Now, if that, I'm afraid you must jettison anything. Cricket is very much. But may I just take up from where the High Commissioner left off?
Very
one issue. I think one of the biggest problems we have in India is that the Prime Minister is about 4 steps ahead of officialdom. And I think that's very noticeable when it comes to creating new relationships or even moving in different directions from the existing ones. And I think the India-Australia relationship has suffered and had given a disproportionate importance to the military strategic dimension, partly because they've been lagging in the other direction. In that context, the speech in Davos, which is probably the first time an Indian Prime Minister has actually spoken against the tradition of protectionism. Now, you must realize that protectionism was an article of faith at one time as far as India is concerned, just as it was an article of faith in Australia for a very long time.
Swapan, we need to...
So all I'm saying is that India our officialdom must actually keep in tune with the political movements which are there.
We just have about a few more minutes to include the audience. Let me begin with what we Indians like, which is straw polls. So how many of you, and raise your hands, who believe that the Australia-India relationship is an idea whose time has come? Please raise your hands.
Bravo.
Majority.
Bravo.
Now I want to ask a group of, the educator is about to leave, and I was going to ask her to tell us, she's been, 3 Melbournians who I encountered in the Marigold Bar yesterday, and she's taught at Wellesley and she's taught international baccalaureate training in Indian schools. What inspires you, ma'am, about India? And introduce yourself.
My name is Robin, and you're right, I've spent a lot of time in India visiting international schools as someone working on behalf of the International Baccalaureate. So I think one of the most profound aspects of Indian life I love is the value that's placed on education, on internationalism, and also the values, the universal values that underpin both Australia and obviously India, but more universal than that. Then, of course, I love all things around the Indian culture, which is why I'm here. And I'm taking home another suitcase full of books.
Great. Okay, there was another, yes, the lady in the yellow jumper. Or you can...
Hi. So I would like to ask you guys, how do you feel in the context of the recent refugee crisis throughout the world? India's inclination to a change in refugee policy, which has turned more stringent, or is inclined to turn more stringent. On the other hand, Australia itself has a hardline refugee policy. And also, could you please say something on the matter concerning the fact that we practically have 2 opposite population problems?
Anyone? One more question. The gentleman with the blue scarf.
We talked about the Quad. I missed the first few minutes. I don't know if the Anglo-Saxon fist, of which Australia is one member, one finger, has been mentioned. So how relevant is the Anglo-Saxon fist of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the UK? How relevant is it still in real security policy for Australia?
Okay, and now come back to my panel, distinguished panel. First, of course, to thank them, but then to seek their last responses. You've clearly seen that the majority in this audience, and while this may be just a random sample, there are at least 400 or 500 people here who believe in the Australia-India relationship. 2 questions: refugees. Does Australia at the end of the day see itself as an Asian power, or still tied to the umbilical cord of the Anglo-Saxon relationship? Greg, would you like to take it?
Amitabh, let me answer that as a true Indian. We are not imprisoned in these false binaries. You know, of course we have an Anglo-Saxon dimension to our past, although my ancestry is Irish. So if you're looking for any loyalty to Mother England from me, you've come to the wrong address completely. But we don't have to choose between being Anglo-Saxon and being Asian. We are promiscuous in our affections. We are a cheap date, you know, a sausage roll and a glass of beer, and we're yours for the evening, really. There's no requirement for us to make hard and fast. Now, but look, I really do agree that we have opposite population problems. We're a very affluent country in Australia, and affluent countries adopt very foolish intellectual fashions. And one of our most idiotic intellectual fashions is the proposition that at 25 million people and with a land mass equal to the United States, we might be nearing our natural limit. It's kind of completely barking mad. We're one of the last countries in the world which desperately needs people. And we're out positively recruiting high-quality immigrants from India, among other places. And just one thought on refugees. I am in favour of a big, generous Australian refugee program, but I am not in favour of people turning up by boat and deciding that they get to live in Australia forever. That is a rorted program, and it is a program which leads to many hundreds or thousands of deaths by sea. So an orderly program is much better. And the final thing on security, the Anglo-Saxon Five, you call it, is relevant in one particular matter, and that is intelligence sharing. The Five Eyes, US, UK, Australia, Canada and New Zealand. That is an extremely intimate intelligence sharing arrangement. We also have very intimate intelligence sharing arrangements with Japan and India and other European powers and so forth. It's not a limitation, but you know, the United States remains by an almost infinite distance the most powerful nation in the world. So if you have a chance to have privileged access to the US intelligence network or not, you know, it's a pretty simple choice.
Okay. Swapan, quick 30-second response, and then I'll let the High Commissioner, Harinder Sidhu, have the final word.
Well, I can only respond to the question about refugees. And I think, by and large, Australia, I think, now has a more robust and I think a fairer system of how to take in people than had ever been in the past. It's gone through its own twists and turns, but by and large, the idea that there should be a need-based and skill-based approach to immigration is very important. And secondly, the idea that people shouldn't be allowed to jump the queue needlessly is also a very good idea. Now, as far as India is concerned, I think we've been hospitable, but I think India has to be also mindful of its own security concerns. And the most important thing here is that to ensure that certain refugees who come from neighboring countries, etc., are allowed to go back and create the circumstances. I think our policy towards the Rohingya problem was right. We tried to ensure that Bangladesh, which gave them sanctuary, also had the right to actually ask for their gradual repatriation, and we ensured that that actually happens. So I don't believe that, you know, the policies of India as far as refugees, etc., should be settled by NGOs. It should be settled by the government of India, depending on its own priorities.
Yeah.
High Commissioner, you have the last word.
Okay, sadly, I wish you hadn't done that because actually as a diplomat I'm the most boring person on this panel. Refugees and the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes, you know, I've worked in the security business for many years myself. That's a relationship of tremendous value. I cannot see Australia diluting that or doing away with that. But Greg is right, and I wouldn't use the word cheap date, of course, but I would find a much more flowery way of describing it. But the thing that we have gained a great deal from is actually building our security relationships beyond that. But I would say for the long term, that would still be a very important part of our structure. On refugees, I think Greg sort of nailed it, but one thing I do want to make the point, when you're a country that has a large immigration program, we bring in 190,000 new Australians every day under our migration program. That's about 1% of our population every year. That's about 1% of our population that we add every year. And that's an extremely generous position. We are also the third largest recipient of refugees in the world under the UNHCR program. So, you know, it's a very welcoming country. But for our country, socially and economically, to absorb those people, there's a bit of a compact that we have with our people, which is to say we will continue to support a multicultural society, a strong migration program, a generous refugee program, but we will do it one way. We won't open the doors, you know, entirely to people coming in by irregular means. And that's as much for keeping society together as it is for exactly the humanitarian reasons that Greg has cited, that the loss of lives of people trying to come to Australia by boat has been really horrific and terribly saddening and awfully tragic, and it's not something we want to encourage at all. So, but for all that, that's it from me.
Thank you, Swapan. Thank you, Harinder. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, ZGLF. Australia-India Institute is delighted to partner with the Jaipur Literary Festival. We'll come back next year. Thank you.